A very good afternoon. Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, Chairman of ISAS NUS and Ambassador at Large, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Professor Subrata Mitra, Director of ISAS NUS, distinguished panelists, esteemed guests, and ladies and gentlemen. My name is Chandrani Sarma and I have the pleasure to be your MC today. Welcome to this afternoon's panel discussion, India under Modi, a midterm appraisal of BJP government. The event is organized by the Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS. This event is a lead-up to the upcoming 3rd South Asian Diaspora Convention. Please feel free to register on the convention website. The flyers are with you together with the program. We look forward to your presence and participation at the convention. And just to inform you, the early bird registration ends on 30th of May. It is my pleasure now to invite Ambassador Gopinath Pillai to give the opening remarks.
Good afternoon, distinguished panelists, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a pleasure to see you all here for this what promises to be a very interesting discussion on a very topical subject. Before I go into that, may I say one or two words about ISAS, because not many of you may be familiar with ISAS. ISAS was founded in 2004 and has been the main research institute and think tank on South Asia. There are very few institutes that take the whole region. They usually concentrate on India. There are far more institutes looking at India rather than the whole region. But we are a little different. We are not typical think tank in that we do a few odd things. For instance, we held reading of poetry composed by Bangladeshi construction workers. It was a very moving and heartwarming event. We do other things too. We not think out of the box, we act out of the box. It's like act east, the same principle. But we do these things with a purpose. Our main purpose is to try and educate Singaporeans on South Asia. Then, if possible, educate South Asians about Singapore and Southeast Asia. These are our main functions. We are funded by the Singapore government through Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Trade and Industry. We try and meet ends meet with that. We occasionally get a donation. One of my dreams is to set up an endowment fund. We have started on that. I also would like to set up a chair on Islam in South Asia, because as you know, India in just over a decade or so will probably have more Muslims than any other country in the world. India is now number 3, I think, after Indonesia and Pakistan. So we have certain programs right now. The present one that we have is basically to look at contemporary Asia, and this is a contemporary event. The main event that we are going to have this year is the convention on South Asian diaspora. This will be the 3rd one. We had the first one in 2011, then 2013, next one would have been 2015, but it happened to be the 50th anniversary of Singapore, and we had a full calendar, so we didn't want to clash with that. So the next one will be July 18th and 19th in Singapore, and we are having a very elaborate program. The guest of honor will be the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka, Ranil Wickremesinghe, and we will have a whole host of other speakers. One of the major items would be dialogue on the first night during dinner between our Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Hsien Loong, and Shashi Tharoor, a former Foreign Secretary of India. Shyam had done one Singapore symposium in Chennai with our Foreign Minister. I thought he did very well. So this time it will be on the 18th night. And we hope as many of you as possible can come and participate. Now let me turn to today's event. Today exactly is the second anniversary of the BJP government. We have assembled a very illustrious group to talk about this. And for this, I must thank Mr. Vinod Rai because he helped us to put together this program. I'm also thankful to him for agreeing to speak. And he chose that he will be the last speaker. But the new format that we are going to follow, Karan Thapar's suggestion, would be that he will start off with questions. So he may want to start with Vinod Rai first, but that's, I leave it to him. I want to thank Karan for sparing the time to come here. Not many Singaporeans will be familiar with him. He is a celebrity in India on the TV. When he jumps out his lower jaw and he makes his eyes narrow, you know that's the time when he goes for the kill on the other side. He's a very good moderator. There are other moderators, other TV personalities who are probably more accomplished in histrionics than Karan. But for a serious viewer, I think Karan is the best that India has. So I'm very pleased that he is coming, and I'm very pleased that he will be moderating this event. Now, after him, we have 5 speakers. We have Pratap, Bhanu, Mehta, a formidable intellectual from India. He also happens to be, he's a research president of the Research Institute, and he's also our visiting fellow. He very reluctantly visits us, but we are always happy to have him. Then we have Surjit Bhalla, another thought leader, chairman of Oxus investment. And then you have my friend, Mr. Shashi Tharoor. Shashi is the MP for a constituency that nobody can pronounce. I've seen the girls in Jeddah struggling to say Thiruvananthapuram, and they've shortened it to T-Puram now. So he does very well, and I'm very glad to see him again. He has been here before as our guest. Then we have another friend, Ashok Malik, a very well-known commentator and Observer Research Institute fellow, and I'm very glad he has come again as our guest. And finally, of course, the wisdom of Vinod Rai. I'm very happy. I said a few words, normally I don't, about the speakers, mainly because Singaporean, my compatriots, may not be familiar with you. So I thought I will just introduce each one of them with one or two of their main accomplishments. It's sometimes a habit among the people who come as for the introductory remark to cover the subject very comprehensively. I don't intend to do that. I think that is the function of the panelists under the able leadership of Karan Thapar. But I want to leave one thought which I have with you and for the panelists. There has been tremendous amount of literature, articles written, speeches made on the second anniversary of Mr. Modi. And most of these have made comparisons. Comparison with the past government, comparison against promises made, comparison with last year's performance. I have no problem with the comparisons. I think they are good, they're needed. But that is not enough. I think one should look at the performance against what the country needs. Let me explain by an illustration. Singapore has got a problem with dengue fever. From time to time it comes up and so on. So our newspapers will publish the number of cases each month. And if it goes down, they trumpet it with headlines. To me, this is half the story. I think Singapore, with its resources, one should ask the question, why haven't we been able to eradicate it? Second, what stage of development are we in eradicating this? This is as an example I'm giving, a Singapore example. But one should look at India when you're talking about doing an appraisal on the basis of what India needs and what has the government done. I think that would be very interesting for us. It must be against action taken against what is needed. That must be. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't want to take up more time. I want to thank you all. I would like to see you all at the SADC, this South Asian Diaspora Convention in July 18th and 19th. And we have something like 35 speakers over 2 days. A lot of discussions, a lot of various types of programs. I'm sure today, with this panel that we have, this illustrious panel that we have, and a very dynamic moderator, you will find this a worthwhile event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Pillai. Ladies and gentlemen, I would now like to invite the following distinguished speakers on stage for the panel discussion. First, the chairperson for the session, Mr. Karan Thapar, President, Infotainment Television, New Delhi. And the following panelists, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, Member of Parliament, Lok Sabha, Republic of India. Mr. Vinod Rai, Visiting Senior Research Fellow, ISAS, and 11th Comptroller and Auditor-General, Govt of India. Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta, Visiting Research Professor, ISAS, and President, Center for Policy Research, New Delhi. Mr. Ashok Malik, Distinguished Fellow, Observer Research Foundation, New Delhi. Dr. Surjit Bhalla, Chairman, Oxus Investment, New Delhi, and Senior India Analyst, the Observatory Group, New York.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a discussion on the second anniversary of the Modi government and how it's performed over this period. I promise you I shall keep my eyes wide open and I will keep my jaw tucked into my collar. However, that said and done, I do intend to be a little provocative because I think it's only when one is being provocative that people give you truthful answers. We're going to structure this discussion a little so that you have a sense of what's to come. Let me tell you, we'll begin with some of the political issues that have cropped up during the last 2 years of Mr. Modi's government. Then move on to the economic achievements or lack of achievements, to the foreign policy issues that he's tackled, and finally some sense of perspective about how Mr. Modi himself, since he's the central person in this government, has performed as Prime Minister. And perhaps right at the end, if we have time, a question about what do the panel expect hereafter? How do they see the next 3 years? Let's then start with politics, and let me begin by putting the first question to Shashi Tharoor, not just because he's a politician, but because he's also Mr. Modi's opponent. In the last 2 years, Shashi, we've had Ghar Wapsi, Love Jihad, beef bans, campaigns against anti-nationalism, a focus on Bharat Mata Ki Jai, and actually you could go on and on. Do you see these as disparate, unconnected events that have just happened coincidentally one after another? Or is there some theme or logic that connects them?
No, I think there's an obvious theme that connects them, and I think it has to do with a certain strand of Hindu chauvinism that has always been embedded in the BJP, the ruling party, which has been given a free rein And so what has happened is that whereas this sort of thing was always attempted in the past, it was attempted by people who had no real power to do very much about it, and never therefore acquired the kind of national salience that these issues now do when they're conducted by people in proximity to those who wield power in our country. And I think, in fact, by mentioning them, you've actually highlighted the singularly most troubling flaw of the Modi government's first 2 years, which is its capacity to have been derailed in its proclaimed faith in development and Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas by a public narrative that is certainly not Sabka Saath, because it excludes, intimidates, and to some degree frightens many of our minorities, but also by a politics of polarization, which may well have to do with a certain strand of belief in the BJP that its long-term political prospects rest on getting a majority of Hindu votes to rally around it, and stirring up chauvinism and then labeling it as nationalism inevitably has a very useful political effect, or so they think. I'm not sure the state elections have borne this out, but it's always interesting that these things crop up just before elections somewhere, whether it's in a state, as in Delhi or Bihar, whether it's a by-election, and there is a tendency to whip up this particular set of sentiments so that there will be agitation amongst the minority section of the population, resultant polarization around the Hindutva barrier, votes for the BJP. I think that is the common thread. I'm not quite sure that my colleagues here would all agree with me, but I think the evidence is pretty irrefutable that this is the only logical conclusion one can draw from all of this.
Pratap, in an article that you wrote for the Indian Express, and I believe it was on the 16th of February, you said, the toleration debate will overshadow everything else, because the protection of freedom is the lifeblood of a democracy. And in that same article, you also wrote, the government does not want to just crush dissent, it wants to crush thinking. Many in the government think you've gone overboard with criticism, that your language was exaggerated. How would you defend that opinion, or would you not back off it?
I would not back off it. I think one has to make, there is a distinction I think that's relevant here, that even if you don't take it as a 100% accurate description, I think it's certainly a worthwhile warning that that is the direction in which the government is heading. I think the threat of majoritarianism is actually palpable. I think the place where I slightly disagree with Dr. Tharoor is, I don't think it's entirely driven by electoral compulsions, actually. I think that would actually be a comforting thought, because I do think the center of gravity in Indian politics is actually centrist. I actually do think Mr. Modi has let that part of the party that actually doesn't think purely in electoral terms, whose DNA is to think in majoritarian terms, get the upper hand, and I think that part of the party will actually continue to be strengthened. But I think I'll raise another related point, which I think is probably a different and perhaps more neutral way of putting this, and I think for the long-term health of India more important. When Mr. Modi came to power, right, the single biggest challenge to my mind that India faced was not just economic growth, which we'll talk about, but there was a deep institutional crisis, right? The institutions of the state begin to lose effectiveness and credibility, right? Where the institutions of the state become mediators of truth, you begin to trust them more to investigate wrongdoing. Ask yourself this question: can you name one institution of the state, right? Courts of law, CBI, National Investigative Agency, arguably even Parliament, that is actually in a better state after this government came to power than before. Even federalism, where Mr. Modi talks a lot about it, we can get into that, right? Because fundamentally, look, we need to get away from this politics of he said, she said. If your institutions are strong, right, all of these ideological battles back and forth will matter much less, right? But if your institutions begin to be partisan, and To be fair, that's not entirely a creation of the Modi government. The Congress has never taken a principled stand on any law pertaining to freedom in India, whether it's in the law on sedition, whether it's playing with majoritarian and minoritarian politics. Right? But Mr. Modi was elected to regenerate institutions. And I don't see that institutional regeneration happening.
Let me put a devil's advocate question to you, Ashok. Pretty close to 90 to 95% of India's Hindus would say Bharat Mata Ki Jai, which is perhaps the most explosive of these particular issues, is a perfectly acceptable thing to say. And it's inexplicable why anyone in India who's an Indian citizen would want to say it. And that means 70 to 75% of the country, if my mathematics is correct, have no problem with it. So when the BJP political resolution passed at their recent national executive says that it is an insult to the constitution not to want to praise Mother India, not to chant victory to Mother India, are they not in consonance with the sentiments and the thinking and the feeling of the majority of the country? And if they are, what's wrong with it?
You know, Karan, you know as well as I do that if a single individual does not want to chant Bharat Mata Ki Jai, that's also perfectly defensible and should be defended in democracy. I'd like to expand that question rather than answer it specifically. A right-wing political tradition or party anywhere in the world, it could be the Republicans in America, it could be the BJP in India, rest on three constituencies. There is what I would call the sensible economics constituency. There is the more robust foreign policy and security policy constituency. There is also an identity constituency. All three matter, all three are important. Some are more salient than the others at various stages in the electoral cycle. The incremental vote in 2014 certainly came from the economics constituency. There's no question of that. But the identity constituency also voted in very large numbers for Mr. Modi. Mr. Modi, as Pratap correctly said, has been on message and has been focused on economic development, on economic issues, because, as he said several times, including in private gatherings where I've been present, fundamentally, he believes the voter in 2019 will judge him on the economy, on the well-being of the individual, the family, and not on these issues. So they're not electorally really viable, these issues. But there are sections of the BJP, I don't have a problem admitting that, who have interpreted the mandate of 2014 disproportionately in religious terms and identity terms. Much of the noise is coming from them. Having said that, there is also their polar opposite, a group that is hostile to the BJP and to Mr. Modi and actually believes such a government is the worst thing that could happen to India. It's a genuine belief, it's not just politics. So some people may be politically opportunistic in believing that, but some actually believe that. They believe that as a matter of principle. And just as some sections of the BJP are, or some perhaps are overreading the Hinduness of the 2014 mandate, there is another group that is being almost conspiratorial in every action or every movement of the BJP and its individual politicians. And they actually believe there's a civil war in the country which may well exist on Twitter, but doesn't exist in the real India. And that is reflected in, frankly, if you look at polling numbers, including on channels you appear on, a lot of people feel that the religious or intolerance tensions that people talk about on Twitter or on television debates, on which we all appear, are not really what common people believe to be.
Let me, Surjit, widen the issue a little before I switch subjects to another one. And I want to raise the question to the level of the nature and conduct and behavior of Indian democracy, rather than focus on specific issues. Yesterday, in an article in the Indian Express, Ashutosh Varshney wrote, electorally, Indian democracy is very successful, but in terms of protecting liberal freedoms, it is not. His exact sentence is, it continues to shine electorally, but its attack on liberal freedoms between elections is a cause of great concern. Would you say, looking not just at the 2 Modi years, but perhaps even deeper back, that that is a true comment? And that in a sense, what has happened in the 2 Modi years that we've seen is a continuation of what's been happening for the last 40, 50 years?
You know, let's take the last 2 years. specifically and try and address Ashutosh's question. And this goes back to what Shashi was saying. You know, there's a peculiar thing, observation, and this was pointed out by a leading politician, neither from the BJP nor from the Congress, who said that, you know, if you look at the elections that have taken place over the last 2 years, that something or the other, divisiveness, peaks during those elections, intolerance, corruption, and all the issues that Shashi rightly mentioned, and then quite immediately, as soon as the last vote is cast, disappears from the discussion. So is that is certainly something that's radically different than what we had before. That's point number one. Point number two is that if we now look at the elections just concluded, including the one in Assam, there wasn't any such incident. But it wasn't because of lack of trying by the Congress party in this instance. Because in third week of March or so, and the election started in the first week of April, a leading Congress party official, Ghulam Nabi Azad, who is the leader of the Rajya Sabha, said that he saw no difference in the actions of ISIS and the RSS. The RSS, as everybody knows, is the parent body of the BJP, and most of the BJP ministers have belonged at one time or another to that. Now, why didn't, and the betting was, I would say, from the Congress party.
I don't think he really said that.
The betting was, sorry?
He didn't really say that. He said, his exact sentence was, I condemn the RSS as I also condemn ISIS. By which he meant, I'm not condemning the RSS as an Indian Muslim. I also condemn Muslim extremist groups like ISIS. Now, you may see that as an unfair juxtaposition, but he didn't equate the two other than in that sense.
Well, certainly the Congress party members did not think that it was being equated. Some other people, many in the media themselves, also disagree with you in that they equated.
Can I ask you to make the point rather than to be contentious with Shashi?
Let me just finish that, and I'll just take one more minute. And so, what happened? There was no reaction from the Tea Party elements of the BJP, who could always be counted on to have a reaction. There was therefore no divisiveness, no intolerance, no hangama, and it turned out that the BJP won in Assam. They got 60 seats on their own, where 64 would be a majority on their own. And if you will, it's a population with 35% Muslims. So I think we may be seeing a turning point in the Indian electoral process over the last 2 years.
Are you therefore saying that Varshney is wrong when he says that in terms of protecting liberal freedoms, India's democracy is not good? Is that the point you're making? That in fact we protect the very
Let me just
West?
explicitly answer the Varshney point. You know, in terms of Indian freedoms, we have the Shah Bhanu case, we have several other instances from the past that I think to make that sweeping conclusion on the basis of, as I said, where there was a confluence of interests in creating divisiveness in Indian society over the last 2 years, I think he's in error.
Okay, except that he wasn't making that point about the last 2 years, he was making that point about the way Indian democracy has functioned over the last 67 years. But let's not quarrel with Varshney, he's not here to defend himself. Let me come to a second issue, Vinod, that has been of great political concern, it's been divisive, and for some, it's been disillusioning. The manner in which President's rule has been imposed, first on Arunachal Pradesh, and the Supreme Court verdict on that is still awaited, we don't know which way it will go. Secondly, on Uttarakhand, and there in fact at the end of the day the Supreme Court ordered a floor test and the Congress government was restored. Do you believe that Mr. Modi let himself down, and in particular let down his promise of cooperative federalism by this use of Article 356 or abuse of it?
Article 356, from the day it's been built into the Constitution, has stood out more in terms of its misuse, if you can say so, than utilized properly. And invariably that article has been used, there have been any number of protagonists against its use than for. I mean, and you can start back from the dismissal of the first communist Kerala ministry in Kerala. There was a communist ministry, it was dismissed for whatever reasons, it was dismissed. Now, whether it was rightly used or wrongly used, hopefully the Supreme Court will put a stamp on it in the legality of its usage. But yes, it does raise large number of questions regarding timing of its use, before or after the floor test, and the fact that in some ways a democratically elected government was being removed in a fashion which would not withstand the test of scrutiny.
If I recall the phraseology that Mr. Modi has repeatedly used when he reaches out to the 28 state governments in India, the phrase is cooperative federalism. And if I recall correctly, the BJP manifesto made a great point of saying that it wasn't just one government, it was 29 governments, of which the central government in Delhi was just one of 29. How much of that attempt to create a new federalism, to create a new relationship between the central and the states, has been damaged by this rather strange, arbitrary, willful, almost defiant usage of Article 356? Pratap.
It has been damaged, and certainly confidence in the government has been damaged. But I think the federalism debate in India, I think, is couched into very simplistic terms. You have to distinguish between financial federalism, administrative federalism, political federalism. Now, one of the paradoxes of federalism globally, right, is some degree of financial devolution, as this government has done on the basis of the Finance Commission's recommendations, and that's generally a good thing, can actually go quite well with administrative centralization and political centralization, right? So one of the interesting tests of federalism is going to become, right now BJP is in the ascendant, it is winning more state governments. What its relationship with non-BJP state governments is actually going to look like, number one. Number two, and this is the more interesting test of political federalism. Pre-Mr. Modi, the BJP had a number of very powerful chief ministers who were independent political entities in their own right? Now Mr. Modi is going to have a Congress party problem, which is to say, the way the party is structured is actually going to lead to greater, in a sense, political centralization, right? And one of the characteristics of Mr. Modi's rule is that he can devolve power financially in a context where actually, in a sense, he also gathers it authoritatively in the Prime Minister's office. So I think you'll see a very interesting interplay between some financial devolution, and by the way, just as a little footnote, GST is actually going to be more centralizing rather than decentralized. It's one of the things people don't realize about GST, right? Because it does cut down the state's room for actually maneuver on the taxation side. So I think the federalism debate needs to be seen in the interplay of financial, administrative, and political centralization, and certainly I think the actions taken in Uttarakhand and Uttarakhand suggest that the tendency towards political centralization is likely to continue.
One last question on the politics of the last 2 years before we come to economics, and I put it to you, Shashi. The Modi government has been progressively, for the last 2 years, stymied in terms of getting legislation passed in the Rajya Sabha, where it doesn't have a majority. Your party and your allies still do, and that continues to be the case even after the recent elections. Do you believe that the Modi government and perhaps Mr. Modi himself hasn't done enough to personally and particularly reach out to Sonia and Rahul Gandhi and try and win them over? Or is there a sense in which you're prepared to accept and admit that revenge is sweet? That the BJP held you up when you wanted to pass legislation in your time, and now, because you're in opposition and because you have the power, you're going to hold the power?
Well, Karan, I've often joked that those of us who went to missionary schools and learned the golden rule about do unto others as you would have them do unto you, that the golden rule of Indian politics is do unto others what they have done unto you. And that's essentially what this kind of behavior
Let me tell you,
can
many of us went to missionary schools, but it was the missionary position we came away with, not golden rule.
having said that, let me stress that the whole obstructionism argument has been grossly overblown by the government for its own purposes. In fact, more than 90% of the bills introduced by the ruling party, by the government, have been passed. 101 bills have been passed in these 2 years. And what is striking is, it's a very detailed and dispassionate analysis, which I've tweeted, Ashok, that explains that this government has introduced far fewer bills than any government in Indian history. They just haven't come up with enough bills for us to obstruct. So in fact, the 101 bills in the last couple of years, there are only a handful of bills involving issues of principle. The GST is a very good example. We came up with the GST concept. It was stoutly resisted by the BJP chief ministers of the day, notably the then chief minister of Gujarat, Mr. Modi. When they came to power, they realized this was a good thing, however, proceeded to take the heart out of the concept by amending it for what were basically nakedly partisan political purposes. And they came back with a bill which objective international analysts said wouldn't even add 0.01% to the economy. The key evidence for this is the preposterous notion of an additional 1% tax that producer states could levy on consumer states. Now, the very notion of the GST is to go away from a situation in which, while Europe has 29 sovereign nations and one common market, we have one sovereign nation and 29 uncommon markets. It's absurd to see all these trucks lined up on every state frontier in our country, waiting to pay excise and octroi and bribes and God knows what else to be allowed to cross a state border. And we said we'll remove all of this and basically have one tax that's nationwide. The moment you start dividing the nation into producer states and consumer states, you're back at square one. You've destroyed the single market idea. And how do you know that Gujarat's goods are going to Rajasthan or whatever, unless you again reintroduce checkposts and points and controls on the borders? So the whole BJP GST bill is not a good GST bill, and it deserves to be opposed on principle. We had 9 similar objections. In a sheer desire to come out of political compromise, we whittled them down to 3. And if the BJP accept those 3, the bill will be passed to the next session. It's simply that the BJP has tried, and many colleagues of mine have told me their fear is that the real opposition to the GST is within the BJP, which has always had a social support base of wholesale merchants, kirana shop owners, mandi merchants and so on, who much prefer not to have to work with cash registers and computerized accounts and bills and taxes, and that they don't want this passed. So the BJP has conveniently come up with a refusal to accept the Congress's entirely reasonable objections in order to ensure this bill is not passed and the Congress can be blamed for it. Now, that's why I believe this entire obstructionism debate is excessive. I believe that, in fact, the government should be introducing more bills. It should be more reasonable. It does not reach out sufficiently. It doesn't compromise sufficiently. The 3 objections we've come down with, this is one. Another one is quite simply that there should be a cap on it. I mean, Singapore has what, 7-point-something%, 8? For your...
You're slightly editing your government's position, which is why I'm interrupting you, because it's not right that we should give the audience here a partisan rather than a factual view.
This is entirely factual.
No, it's not. To be honest, you're insisting on a constitutional cap, not a cap below, a cap written into the Constitution, and the government's
because the bill is a constitutional
the government's position is that if you write a cap into the Constitution, it becomes very difficult to amend. Amending the Constitution in India is a very cumbersome, prolonged process, and as a result of which, if you have a disaster in a state, God forbid Canada, where it is then required that immediate excise duties need to be raised, you'll be unable to do so without a constitutional amendment, which is why Mr. Jaitley's position is, I'm happy to agree to a cap, don't put it in the Constitution. And by the way, as regards the 1%, Arvind Subramaniam, the Chief Economic Advisor, has already indicated on behalf of the government that he believes it should be dropped, and it's widely believed that too will be dropped. The real sticking
haven't dropped it yet. They say they will consider doing
the real sticking point between the two of you is actually over the judicial mechanism to resolve disputes within the and that is to be, your position is that it should be handled by someone from the judiciary, and the government says taxation is the last prerogative of Parliament. Do not hand it to a judge, even a retired judge, because we'll be handing over a major prerogative of Parliament to the judiciary, and already the judiciary has crept into the legislature's prerogatives more than it should have. But let's not bother on GST.
That's what I must say.
I'm saying correctly, I think it's only fair.
No, you should, definitely, but I don't think you've actually contradicted what I've said. You've really clarified or amplified certain details. But the positions remain the same. If these 3 things are agreed to, we have a bill.
Shashi is a master politician and diplomat. I haven't contradicted, I've only clarified.
And amplified.
Let's come to economics. Because for most people in India, the reason they voted for the Modi government and for Prime Minister Modi himself was the belief that achhe din aane wale hain, good days are about to come. And there's no doubt that huge expectations were written into the mandate that Mr. Modi would literally change the Indian economy beyond shape. Now, Surjit, when you look at the macro picture, there's no doubt the economy is doing extremely well. It's growing at 7.6%. Inflation, even though it's gone up to 5.3, is still well within comfortable regions. The current account deficit and the fiscal deficit are in very comfortable territory, and we had record FDI last year of 51 million, higher than any other single fiscal ever. But when you look at the micro picture, you seem to get a very disconcerting idea. Private investment is flat. Bank lending to corporates is negligible. Corporate growth and corporate earnings, going by surveys for the last 4 quarters, except the last, has actually been bad and slow and declining. Factories, according to the Governor of the Reserve Bank, are running at 30% below their capacity. Consumer demand is low, job creation is low. Why is the macro picture so glowing and the micro picture so discomforting?
You know, I don't want to get into a falsehoods debate that we just had from Shashi. I have not heard such a series of falsehoods.
But let's move beyond that.
Let me also point out 2 other falsehoods, which Shashi might want to use. Not falsehoods, 2 other facts actually. That the BJP, when it was in opposition, not only passed every bad bill that the Congress came up with, it also never passed any good bill that the Congress came up. So you really have something to beat them up with, that they really, and let's hope you guys don't do the same.
I don't think I use it in exactly
but you are doing exactly the same with the opposition to the GST and rattling off these falsehoods in there. Let me come to the economy. You know, look, Karan, you're absolutely right. You mentioned 2 things, and only 2 things in the beginning, to say that GDP was good and inflation was low. Now, there aren't too many other statistics, there are too many other indicators that are not absorbed within the GDP as well as inflation. So you can have exports going up or exports going down, something else happening, something else not happening. You can have your FDIs coming in, but if the FDIs coming in don't result in growth, I don't want that FDI. So I think the real parameter that everybody uses, or not everybody, at least economists use, is GDP growth and inflation. Now, on these 2 indicators, it so happens that the Indian economic performance over the last 2 years has been the second best in the last 20 years. That is, our growth rate, and how do I come to that simple conclusion, is you take a peer group of countries, not I think so, therefore it is so. You take a peer group of countries, emerging markets, or emerging countries, non-developed economies with more than 30 million population. Our GDP growth rate is about 2 percentage points higher than their growth rate over the last 2 years, and our inflation rate is about 1.5% or 1% higher than theirs. But in this same framework, if you use this across time, the 2 best years in India's history since '96 is '99 and 2000, which was under Bajpayee, and the second 2 best years were 2004 and 2005. So if you take in the long sweep of 20 years, that in these 2 years, when you had also a factor called 2 successive droughts, which is only the 3rd time since 1950 we've had, to have that stellar growth performance and to have, if you will, inflation well under control, and including food inflation, which one would have not expected to spike up because of the bad weather, that has been brought down. Now, whether you give that credit to the Ministry of Finance or whether you give the credit to the RBI, that's a separate issue, and I think it's not a separate issue in the sense both of them have actively worked together. And that's the last point I want to make on the Indian macroeconomy, that I have never seen the close coordination between the RBI and the government as in this 2 years. So
why is private investment flat? Because that was the second critical half of the question, which you deftly ignored.
No, I don't answer that.
I do.
Basically, the investment rate in India is around 31-32%. At its peak, it was 39. It's averaged about 34-35. So what has happened is that government investment has taken a larger role in the last 2 years than private investment. That's as it, not as it should be, but that's as it is. Once the seeds have been sown, and I think a large amount of seeds have been sown in the last 2 years, then you will see if we come here a year from now and private investment isn't up, then that micro detail will be relevant. Right now, it's not relevant.
Ashok Malik, something that the government takes great pride in, and I think Mr. Modi has referred to this several times in his speeches, is the fact that India's ranking in terms of the World Bank Ease of Business rankings has shot up by 12. And Arvind Panagria, in a whole series of articles, he's the chairman of Niti Aayog, has written glowingly about this particular aspect of the Modi government's performance. But if you look at what Americans have been saying, and they've been saying it pretty loudly, and I'll quote to you the Assistant Secretary of State for Commerce in America, he said this in February. He said, US businesses still find it difficult to do business in India due to an inconsistent regulatory environment, systemic infrastructure bottlenecks, lack of transparency, and uncertainty in corporate governance rules. And just 2 days ago, the National Association of Manufacturers says, despite statements made by Prime Minister Modi and other senior Indian officials over the last 2 years, there has been very limited progress in many key areas that make it challenging to do business in India. Do the Americans not realize that we've jumped 12 places, or do those 12 places not matter at all?
Karan, two different things. One, you're quoting a partisan view, a legitimate view, but a partisan view, in what is an ongoing and long-standing trade debate and market access debate between certain American constituencies and in India, including the National Association of Manufacturers. So they are not the best adjudicators of India's economic performance, though India's economic performance by itself could have problems. Second, a lot of what you said about lack of transparency, bottlenecks, and so on and so forth have been true for the past 50 years. They're true for the past 2 years, they're true for the past 50 years. The question is, are things getting better or not? Most people would recognize that things are getting better, that this is a government which is more business-like, the upper echelons of which are less susceptible to subjectivity and cronyism. The phone calls to banks to pour more money into bad projects have stopped. Which is why private investment is not actually, private companies are not coming forward and putting in more money because they're all over leveraged and they're being asked to take haircuts. So all of that is certainly progress and is certainly building scope for transparency. Second, this also takes us back to the federalism story, because what do you mean by ease of business in India? India is a monster of a subcontinent. It's just so big. Ease of business in Tamil Nadu and Jammu and Kashmir could be very different. What the Modi government has done is fostered a genuine competitiveness between states. And you have this very competitive nature of states competing for rankings in the ease of business league, as it were. And that, to my mind, is a more important indicator of how India is changing than a national or a pan-Indian ease of business ranking. It's not where India ranks vis-a-vis other countries, it's where India's states rank vis-a-vis each other.
I'll just add that at Davos, the finance minister had the following to say about ease of business in India. One main reform which is still a work in progress is ease of doing business in India. We don't have a great track record on that. So Mr. Jaitley at least accepts that the performance is not fully summed up by that leap of 12 places.
And the improvement is from 142 out of 189 to 130 out of 189. In the World Bank's latest list, we are 130 in ease of doing business. So let us not be too self-congratulatory to her. Clarifying, amplifying, not contradicting.
And you could clarify further by saying that some of that leap of 12 basis is actually because they changed the way they do their calculations. So we gained 4 statistically rather than because of improvement, because they changed the way of calculating. But let's come to an issue that is of deep concern to the economy in particular. And I want to put it to you, Vinod, because you are also the new chairman, the first chairman of the Bank Bureau Board. And this is to do with what's called non-performing assets in India. By some calculations, they are said to be 4 lakh crore, that's 400,000 times 400,000 crore. It's a huge amount. It's increased by some 450% since 2011. And in some cases, it's said that the non-performing assets of individual, private, public sector banks are actually greater than the net worth of those banks themselves. How serious is this problem?
Well, we have a problem. It's a problem which is spanned the world today, like global economies. But I need to, just to punctuate, you talked about ease of business, I'll just take it from there. We were at 142 years of, after independence, we were at 142. If we can go up 12 positions in 2 years or 3 years, I think it's a remarkable achievement. And we need to certainly congratulate ourselves on that, because steps towards easing or doing business easily are being taken. Now, regarding non-performing assets, we have a problem on our hands. Why? We need to go into it. And Dr. Bhalla referred to it, but he didn't elaborate on it, in the sense that, let me take you back to why the economist has done a study on crony capitalism and its contribution. And what does the economist say? That in the last decade or so, billionaire wealth has gone up tremendously in India. It was 18% of GDP till about 3 years back. Today it is 3% of GDP. Why? Largely, the commodity markets have contributed to their erosion of the capital wealth. But these were the very same companies who mushroomed out of nowhere, and what Surjit said was, based on telephone calls, took loans from public sector banks, set up infrastructure projects in which they had no domain experience, over-leveraged themselves, and automatically found themselves in the corporate debt restructuring. Now, what has accumulated over the last 7 or 8 years has to be put an end to. And unfortunately, the economic history of India will bear fruit to the fact that investment has come to a grinding halt, because today the banks don't have enough capital to lend. There's been an erosion of capital. And who are these people? We need to go into it. There are just about 15 names or 18 names. You figure them out, and you know why lending was made to them.
Pratap, as Vinod was speaking, you were nodding your head. I couldn't work out whether you were nodding your head in agreement or disagreement. Do you agree that India's acquired 4 lakh crore NPAs because over the last 7 years of the UPA government, that's the predecessor government, industrialists could pick up phones and ring up their ministers who are friends and say, help me, I need money, and they got it. Is that the real nub of the problem?
So, that is a large part of it. I mean, one thing I think one has to say in favor of this government, I think we did not realize the extent of the mess UPA bequeathed to us. I mean, there's still more stuff going to come out. This is, it's truly, if you want to see an economic regime corrupt and rotten to its core, no question. And so the cleanup is going to take much longer. However, having said that, I think it's too soon to call the jury out on corruption. I mean, look, when you're ascendant in power, money comes anyway, so there's no electoral incentive to mobilize money. And as I said, I don't see any major reform in any of the investigative institutions to actually show that we've actually turned the corner. I think it's a kind of political hoarding pattern. But I do want to shift this economic question slightly, because I must confess I'm a little disquiet at the kinds of things we focus on in this conversation. The ease of doing business rankings are silly, okay? Let's be clear. It's a game. Which countries are gamed? You look at the countries which are in the top 10, Russia is number 1. You want to go invest in Russia? The Economist has declared China more closed economy than India for the last 20 years. This is a parlor game, right? The real issue, and I think this is the simplest way of judging the economic performance of the government. What makes a country competitive? Energy costs, right? This government is trying. I think it does have an ambitious plan to make 24/7 electricity available and restructure discount debts, but this is still a very, very long way off. Second element is logistics. Again, 50-50 credit to this government. I think there's more activity in the road sector, I think the port sector. The railway story from the point of view of railway governance is improving, but the investment just ain't coming, and there is no roadmap for investment in the railways, okay? Third and most critical important variable of competitiveness is human resources, right? This government is a walking disaster in education, okay? Fourth most important element of competitiveness is a kind of general attractiveness, sort of in a sense, kind of quality of life. I mean, one of the reasons Indian capital is moving abroad, like Chinese capital, is because you have polluted cities, because, kind of mobility is sort of difficult. On there, the record is mixed. I think these are actually the things to look at, rather than these very sort of surface indicators that you can actually gain. And finally, which has not been mentioned, the health sector, the government doesn't even know where to begin.
NPA, Surjit, are a great challenge for the government, but possibly greater still is the challenge of job creation. India needs 10 million jobs, Rajiv Kumar says 12 million jobs. But the most recent survey by the Labour Bureau, which I believe is the most reliable way of estimating how many jobs we are creating each year, says that the top 8 labor-intensive sectors only created, wait for it, 1.35 lakh jobs. That's 135,000 jobs in 2015, against a demand of 10 or 12 million.
It's the lowest job creation in 20 years.
It's certainly the lowest job creation since the survey began in 2009, without doubt, and it may well be the lowest in 20 years as well. Are we, if we continue in this way, in danger of turning our demographic dividend, of which we are so proud, into a potential possible demographic disaster?
One of the panelists mentioned, and I think that is what we should pursue in terms of, after all, this panel is about evaluating 2 years of performance. Performance is delta, is change, not the level. So when Pratap says our education is a disaster, what is most relevant for this conversation, which I happen to completely agree it's a disaster, is the delta. Has education improved or has education deteriorated? Has economic growth gone up? Has it gone down? Has healthcare improved or has it deteriorated? The fact that we are at an abysmal level in both education and healthcare is neither here nor there.
Are you about to suggest that in fact healthcare has improved in the last 2 years, that education has improved?
Well, I'll answer that by way of I'll answer that by way of your original question on jobs. You are getting into a very tricky area, which I don't think needs to the audience would want. But let me answer the jobs area, where the distinguished Congress representative was very quick to point out that it is the lowest in the last 20 years. Now, please excuse me while I give you the following statistic, because we are talking statistics over here. The story about job growth in India was that between 1999 and 2004, jobs grew at 2.8% per annum. Between 2004 and 2011, total aggregate jobs at the time of the highest growth rate we ever had was 0.8% per annum. So when you look at 1 year, please look at the delta. Do not look at the absolute level. So the job growth problem has been there in India for the last 15 years. Now, I'm not saying that it is good or bad. All I'm saying is we're talking performance, and before throwing out statistics, it's the worst in the last 20 years. We should be a bit careful. Now, let me answer second about jobs. This is something that economists, serious economists, are looking at. And it turns out that as far as the unemployment rate in the National Sample Service is concerned, we've consistently had unemployment rates between 3 and 4%. You may accept that, you may not accept that, but that's the fact. What is happening in jobs? And actually, here's where the situation is not as bad, and I'm not attributing this to necessarily to the last 2 years, but to the following. You have an alternate source of data from the Employee Provident Fund Organization. Until about 2013-14, the jobs that they were reporting, we can actually get the jobs that they're reporting, was catching up with the number of salaried people in the economy. As more and more of the salaried people in the economy came to be part of the EPFO. Now the EPFO is showing, if you will, 3 to 6% rate of growth of jobs. So it is completely, radically opposite to what you're saying.
Except that I was simply, just so that the audience knows, quoting the Labour Bureau of the Labour Ministry run by Mr. Modi's government, and it is in fact a statistic that the Modi government itself goes by. It wasn't a random figure that I picked out of thin air.
No,
it's the government's own figure.
All I'm saying is this is a serious issue, and I think it needs to be dealt to in a serious manner. The situation is not as bad as made out by the Modi government's data. Fine. I couldn't give, and there were 8 industries that the labor survey, the unemployment and employment survey for the 8 industries, they're supposed to be labor-intensive industries, and what you need to look at, which I am actually looking at now, I don't have the answer, is how have these industries done in the previous 10 years in order to get a good comparison.
Okay, we'll wait till you have the
May I answer that, because I actually have the figures right now.
Go ahead, go ahead.
So, textiles, leather, metals,
This is not the Indian Parliament.
No. Gems and jewelry, transport, information technology, handloom sectors altogether. So 2015, they created 135,000 jobs, as you correctly said. 2014, the last year of the Manmohan Singh government, 421,000 jobs. So there was a 67% decline between the UPA government and the NDA government. The figures for previous years, 419,000 jobs in 2013, 321,000 in 2012, 929,000 in 2011. During the boom years, I mean, Surjit, you've been using the word...
Can I interrupt? I think
870,000 in 2010 and 1.28 million in 2009. These are government of India.
You made your point, but I don't think this should become a contentious issue between the two of you. The point I was emphasizing is that against the 10 to 12 million that we need, the best that you quoted is 900,000,
1.28 million,
which is less than 10% of what we need.
Even the 10 to 12 million that we need is a false one. It has to do with labor force participation, and the unemployment rate is where you need to look at as to what you need, and the unemployment rate has stayed steady.
All right. Let's then come at that happy moment when there's a little bit of silence between the two of them to the RBI governor, because I'm sure it'll spark the same discord again. At the moment, Shashi, there's enormous public contention about whether Raghu Ram Rajan, considered one of the best governors we've had, one of the best central bank governors at the moment anywhere in the world, will be given or should be given an extension or not. That is clearly, in a sense, a reflection of the way he relates with this government. Nirmala Sitharaman, the Commerce and Industry Minister not so long ago, advised him publicly, admonished him publicly to use better words when he chose to describe the situation in India akin to that well-known Indian phrase, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed is king. He said the Indian economy situation was somehow similar or best described by that phrase. More recently, Subramanian Swamy has publicly, he's a BJP MP, publicly written to the Prime Minister accusing Raghu Ram Rajan of deliberately wrecking the economy and suggesting that he should either be sacked or his tenure not extended at the end of its present term in September. He also said that because because this man is a green card holder, he's mentally only half Indian.
As you know, the BJP has a lot of supporters amongst the NRI community, most of whom carry foreign passports. And Mr. Modi addresses them with great enthusiasm wherever he travels. So I don't know what percentage of Indian mentally they're considered to be. But as somebody said in relation to that particular comment, the individual who made it was fully mental. So I think you can often measure the worthiness of a position by who takes it. And given the nature of those who are calling for Mr. Rajan's defenestration, I would suggest that he probably must be extremely good and should therefore be retained. But frankly, it's none of our business. This is a decision the government will make. I do believe, however, that what they need to do is to end this rather unseemly public wrangling over the tenure of a public servant in an extremely sensitive position. June is not too early to make a decision and announce it to end the disquiet that is implicit in your questions. I hope they will take a decision and announce it quickly. Incidentally, on the one-eyed man in the land of the blind, Mr. Rajan wrote a rather fulsome apology to the blind.
He did indeed.
Could I? You know, this Raghuram Rajan controversy or ongoing saga needs some clarification. He's a very talented man. He is more outspoken and has given more public speeches than many of his predecessors on a whole range of issues, from history to democracy to, of course, the economy to monetary policy and so on. He does sometimes say things that people in the BJP would rather he would not have said. That's fair enough. Having said that, he also has very high credibility and the government recognizes that. In terms of, despite Mr. Jaitley, the finance minister, and Raghuram Rajan being very different personalities, one's a laid-back person, one's a much more flamboyant person. Despite that, on bank cleanup, for instance, I think they've both been on the same page. They've both been fairly determined and fairly honest in their approach. Actually, I see more congruence behind the scenes, behind the tabloids, behind the headlines, behind the talk show debates, behind the Twitter chatter, than contest between the two of them, even though they have very different personalities. If you ask me to bet, I'd say Raghuram Rajan would stay on and be used by this government.
Let's come to foreign affairs. You want to... Sure.
You could change the dramatist person name, but go back to 3 generations of governors of the RBI. There have been same demands against all 3. Isn't it? The dramatist person could have been different. The NRI green card attitudes could have been different, but there have been any number of calls to remove them at any point of time, and I can tell you 3 generations back.
So what you're saying is that traditionally finance ministers in India don't know how to get on with their governors of the Reserve Bank, and often when the governor of the Reserve Bank is more talented and certainly more popular than the finance minister, it rankles with the politician. And the lesson hasn't been learned.
Shashi has still not appointed Dr. Subramanian Swamy as the finance minister of India. Let's wait for that to happen.
And Karan, one point on this. But around the world, the governor of the central bank or the Fed president or whatever is a major issue, and people take sides. In the US, you had whether it should be Larry Summers or whether it should be Janet Yellen. I think, you know, it is very much part of a democracy that this be discussed. It's another issue that nobody that I know of, and there are only 2 people that have publicly come out in support of Subramanian Swamy. One person is Gurumurthy, who's the head of the Swadeshi Jagan Manch. So to attribute this thing to the BJP is, I think, in error.
No, it's not. Subramanian Swamy is a BJP MP.
And so, therefore, what you're saying is there were several Democrats and there were several Republicans who then spoke, and maybe there were Democratic congressmen who said that it should be Larry Summers, and Democratic congressmen.
I think you made your point.
Yeah.
Let's come to foreign affairs. Pratap, there is, I think, still a belief that Mr. Modi is exceptionally, and many people would say surprisingly good at handling a subject of which he had absolutely no experience that we at least knew of before he became Prime Minister. He showed enormous flair when he invited all the heads of government of the 6 SAARC countries to his swearing in. He's got on extremely well personally with President Obama, including getting him to come for Republic Day. He's got on with Xi Jinping. He's got a close relationship with Shinzo Abe. He's also, to everyone's surprise, taken certain initiatives with Pakistan. Has he shown flair? Has India's handling of foreign policy become more adept under him? Or is it just that he gives it a higher profile and his personality suggests that in fact we're moving, but maybe the change is smaller?
I think I'd cut him more slack on this. I mean, I do think there has been a vigor and candor with which he has approached, I think, almost all our relationships. And I think that's certainly to be, in a sense, I think welcomed. It's curiously one of the only places where he has actually taken even a little bit of political risk against his own constituents. I think dropping into Nawaz Sharif's banquet was an example of that. Wish he'd take this kind of political risk for domestic worthy causes as well. And let's also be clear that I think the entire international system, right? I mean, you are in this incredible moment in world history, right, where all the assumptions we made about globalization over the last 15, 20 years are in a sense being pushed back. There is great uncertainty in great power politics and great power politicians. So it is a very treacherous time. So I think it's a bit unfair to expect that he would actually come out and show that here is a big structural breakthrough that I've made. I think that's still, in a sense, I think eludes this government, but I would not, in a sense, kind of fault him for trying. I think the only caveat I think I would make on, in a sense, the foreign policy story is, which is the following, which is, I do think the theatre does run far ahead of the structural realities that India finds itself under. I do think, for example, that in our approach to globalization as a whole and great power politics, I think the picture is not entirely clear. It seems to me that Mr. Obama has charmed Mr. Modi a bit too much. But those are, in a sense, matters of judgment. But I certainly, I think his handling has, on the whole, been deft, and frankly, I think there is also a team underneath that displays some degree of assurance, unlike in many other areas.
Ashok, for the Indian people, the relationship with Pakistan is the one that they focus on most of all. It's the one that tends to be the most contentious. And there is a view that what we've seen in the last 2 years is a series of inexplicable U-turns in Mr. Modi's handling of Pakistan. And that has led his critics to begin to applaud him because they like the most recent U-turn, and it's led his admirers to be disconcerted because they can't understand what he's up to. Do you see a line of logic in his handling of Pakistan, or is he simply learning as he goes along, and is he unafraid to change when he realizes he was wrong?
2 points. One, I disagree with you when you say that Indians, for the Indians, the Pakistan relationship is the Uber relationship. If you look at statistical data, I particularly quote the Lowy Institute poll on Indian foreign policy 2 or 3 years ago, which I studied deeply. There's been other data as well, which says that Indians devote less and less time, or today's Indians devote less time to Pakistan than their predecessors did. This is true as India is growing younger. This is also true as India and Indians are developing international relationships, whether at the individual level or at the institutional level, with a variety of other international interlocutors and emerging economies, whether the US or ASEAN or Singapore or China or whatever. So actually Pakistan is beginning to matter less and less in our foreign policy calculus. That doesn't mean we should ignore it, not at all. I'm not suggesting that. All I'm saying is the obsession with Pakistan that a section of the Delhi elite have is not the obsession that the rest of the country necessarily shares. Second, on Mr. Modi's Pakistan policy, I think it can be divided into 2 phases. One, between August 2014 and November or December 2015, and one after December 2015. Between August 2014 and December 2015, Mr. Modi sought to give the impression that he was a tough leader, which he's entitled to doing. He sought to product differentiate himself from his predecessor and say, I am going to talk tough. I think the instrument he used, or his advisors used, which was the Hurriyat instrument, that don't talk to the Kashmiri dissident group, the Hurriyat, the Pakistani shouldn't talk to them before talking to the Indians, was very befuddling. Because in the end you had to climb back. I think that was done. Post-December 2015, when the two foreign secretaries and national security advisors met in Bangkok, following which the foreign minister went to Islamabad for the Afghanistan conference, the Heart of Asia conference. Then you had the Pathankot terrorist attack where India responded, the government responded very maturely. It did not, it allowed the Pakistani investigative team to come to Pathankot and look at the evidence and presented the evidence to them. I think there's been a greater consistency and a learning post-December 2015, where channels with Pakistan have been kept alive because a certain minimum communication between the two countries, between two nuclear powers is expected, and is expected for mature countries such as India. But Mr. Modi's also made it clear, and I think here he reflects popular opinion in India, that in the absence of an economic relationship, which Pakistan itself is thwarting, in terms of South Asian connectivity, for instance, the India-Pakistan relationship is really one about terrorism and security. There is no other game.
Two questions before we then take questions from the audience and put them to the panel. First, Shashi, has Mr. Modi over the last 2 years fashioned a new, unique foreign policy tool with the rallies that he holds in New York, London, Tokyo, Sydney, Dubai? I mean, there are probably other cities that I can't recall. Is this a new tool that hasn't been used in the past and that is particularly effective today?
First, let me just preface this by saying that I am chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of Parliament. I have to speak with a certain sense of responsibility, and I want to stress that there is really no such thing as a BJP foreign policy and a Congress foreign policy. There is only Indian foreign policy, and I speak against that background. Having said that, I also agree with Pratap about the energy and vigor that the Prime Minister has brought to policy, but I disagree respectfully with my colleagues about their willingness to grant full marks on a number of, because there have been elements of incoherence, confusion, inconsistency, and so on in all these areas, including especially Pakistan, which one can point out to, but I realize you don't have the time for a detailed discussion. Let me then answer your specific question. The answer is there isn't a general answer. It depends on the receptivity of the country concerned to a foreign leader coming and addressing his own diaspora on their soil. And that will be a function of both that country's policies generally, the host country's attitude to the diaspora in that country, and the international geopolitical context of the time. And you can't imagine Xi Jinping addressing the Chinese of Calcutta. I'm not Xi Jinping Mao in those days, or Zhou Enlai, back in 61, 62. It would not have been acceptable. You do know that while Mr. Modi has addressed rallies of his enthusiastic fellow Indians, many of them not Indian citizens, but the Indian diaspora in all the cities you mentioned, when he asked to be able to distribute free bicycles to Nepalese, they stopped him. The Nepalese government said, no, this is not a welcome initiative. So it will vary from country to country. I think it's an unusual thing to do. It's borderline dangerous in the sense that it does look as if you're creating and encouraging extraterritorial loyalties amongst people who have chosen to make their livelihood and their futures in other lands, under other governments. In democracies, it by and large works okay because the leaders of those democracies want the votes of the people sitting there hailing Mr. Modi. So I think it was fine in Madison Square Garden. It certainly was fine in Wembley, where Mr. Cameron came along and spoke a sentence or two in Hindi in order to have some of the benefit of this enthusiasm rub off on him. It would probably be not so easy in some other countries where the sensitivities may be somewhat different. I don't know, for example, if it would be welcome in Saudi Arabia in the same way that it was permitted and encouraged even in the UAE. So let's say it's an interesting technique. It has more to do with the domestic constituency. He speaks usually in Hindi. His speech is broadcast back to India. That's where the real audience is. It is not to do with foreign policy, but to do with shoring up a base of support for his policies at home.
We have time only for one last question, and I want to focus for that last question on some sort of sense of assessment of Mr. Modi himself, because after all, he is the man at the very center of this government and the man with whom that huge mandate is critically associated. Vinod, Venkaiah Naidu, his urban development minister, 2 months ago called Mr. Modi, and I'm quoting, God's gift for India. Do you agree with Mr. Naidu, or do you think Mr. Naidu is being a bit of a sycophant?
Karan, I don't necessarily have to agree or disagree with an individual's statement. You quoted Ashutosh, you quoted Nirmala Sitharaman, you quoted Subramanian Swamy and now Venkaiah Naidu. Well, Mr. Modi is a Prime Minister, elected to that office by the bulk of the nation. After a long time, we've had a single party majority in the country. Good, bad, ugly, whichever way, we have to endure it for another 3 years. But let's see, it's a culmination of events which has brought him to where he is today. Now, whether he is God's gift to help us solve the problems that we are in, we'll soon find out. But no one person ultimately becomes that messiah, if I can say. It's a team that works towards it. But let's look at a lot of issues that have happened. I must say that, and I speak from an auditor's perspective, in the sense that an auditor is always the harbinger of news which is not good. Nobody likes to hear an auditor, least of all see him. But I must say that today I'm a totally retired, unemployed, benign private citizen, watching Indian politics and economics from a distance. I must say that he has made an attempt to combine some of the innovative advantages that have been brought by the UPA government. For example, first policy step he took, retaining Aadhaar, which could have easily been set aside by any government which was wanting to set its own roadmap. And what did Aadhaar do? Digitized ration cards. 320 million ration cards have been digitized because of use of Aadhaar. How many duplicate kerosene users? All of them have been found out and eliminated. Then direct benefit transfers to the recipients of the benefits that the government gives out. All of them have been systematized using this phenomenon. And I think it's a great thing for any Prime Minister to accept a previous government to have put in place a scientific movement which can be taken forward. That's number one. But look at the innovations which have come about. We could easily say that in the Delta period, you have not made a difference. Yes, but what has been accumulated over 20 years, 25 years, you cannot undo in 2 years. To begin something is easy, but to unravel and then begin again becomes that much more difficult. Now I think we need to give credit where it needs to be. We have pointed out lots of problems. There are very genuine problems, maybe social, maybe political, but on the economic front, I think that lots has been done which needs to be congratulated.
I want to give the last question to Pratap because, as Ambassador Pillai said when he introduced him, he is in fact the greatest thinker of us all. And I'm going to, Pratap, be a little contentious, and I want to go back to that wonderful article you wrote in February and quote from it again. Let's not deny, you said, the fact that Mr. Modi's victory seems to have empowered a bunch of forces, let's say a bunch of nasty people, whose prejudices about Muslims and whose short-sighted views of Indian history pose a threat to the secular Indian fabric. I'm repeating that quotation for one reason only, because that, most people would agree, is perhaps the real downside of the last 2 years, this emerging threat. There's been a lot that's happened that's good in terms of economics, maybe not so much in terms of health and education. There's been a change, as Surjit says, in terms of the way people view the Indian economy and the way outsiders view India and its potential. But how serious, as you look down the next 3 years, is this threat of these bunch of loonies who've been empowered? Or is it only a passing problem?
Let me put it this way. I mean, it's hard to look into the future, and we can have an empirical debate about threats, but I'll go back to the institutional point. We have not seen evidence that the state is willing to take on these elements as a liberal democratic state should, through the use of rule of law and proper institution building. I think that's all that needs to be said. I mean, we can, otherwise we can get into an arcane debates. And I think Mr. Modi's biggest challenge, I think in the next year and a half, and just to kind of set the cat amongst the pigeons, I think ironically, BJP's victory in Assam, I think the consolidation of Mr. Amit Shah's position in the party is actually going to make Mr. Modi's job tougher in actually taking him on exactly these elements that he needs to as Prime Minister of India.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we come to the end of the panel discussion, but we have time for questions from the audience. If any of you would like to ask questions, could I ask you to raise your hand? Wait for someone to bring a mic to you. Briefly identify yourself and then ask the question. And perhaps, as Shashi said, it would be a great help if you could stand up when you ask the question so that he can see.